Her flight to paradise was booked, so was mine, right next to hers. Daniel Carter had never been the jealous type. Suspicious, sure. Analytical, absolutely. But jealousy felt too desperate, too insecure. Yet there he was, standing in the middle of their walk-in closet, flipping through a stack of hotel keycards he'd found hidden in Olivia's designer suitcase. Each plastic rectangle was a timestamp, a silent witness to nights he wasn't supposed to know about. Dan ran his thumb across the edges, counting 12. He knew something was off for months. The subtle shifts, Olivia's sudden interest in fitness, the secretive smiles at her phone, her rehearsed nonchalance when he walked into the room. But it was the key cards that turned suspicion into fact. The last one bore the logo of Azure Sands Resort and Spa, her so-called business conference destination. The same resort they'd honeymooned at a decade earlier. It felt like a personal insult. He didn't confront her right away. No late-night accusations or dramatic shouting matches. Instead, Dan poured himself a glass of vintage champagne, his ritual for decisions that changed everything, and made his own travel plans. Seat 1425, seat 14B, right beside Olivia. When the day came, Olivia's excitement was palpable. She hummed while packing, careful to choose outfits that walked the line between professional and seductive. Dan played along, even offering to drive her to the airport, a gesture she politely declined. "I'll grab a cab, honey. You have that early meeting, remember?" Dan kissed her goodbye at the door, waited 5 minutes, then grabbed his carry-on and hailed his own cab to jail. He spotted her immediately at the gate, phone in hand, sending a message she'd later claim was to her assistant. Dan approached silently, settling into the seat beside her just as she glanced up. The moment her gaze landed on him, her smile froze. Not fear, not yet, just confusion. "Surprise," Dan said, voice light. "Thought I'd finally take that vacation you keep telling me I need." Olivia recovered quickly, her corporate smile snapping into place. "Dan, you never told me you were... What a coincidence." She leaned in for a quick peck, her eyes scanning for exits like a caged animal. "What about work?" "Delegate and celebrate," he said, raising his plastic cup of airline Prosecco. "What are the odds we ended up on the same flight?" She laughed, too loud, too bright. "Crazy, right?" He let the silence stretch as the plane taxied. Olivia's fingers drummed an anxious rhythm against her tray table. Dan watched the runway blur by, knowing this flight was the first act of a carefully scripted finale. She had spent years lying. Now they were heading straight to the place where every lie would unravel. He had booked their suite, the one with the ocean view and the private terrace where she once promised forever. By tomorrow, she'd know that paradise was no longer hers alone. The plane had been in the air for 20 minutes. And Daniel had already counted Olivia's nervous glances. 12 so far, matching the number of hotel key cards he found in her suitcase. She sat rigid beside him, her body angled slightly toward the aisle, as if hoping proximity alone would make this shared flight a bad dream she could wake up from. Dan sipped his mediocre Prosecco, savoring the awkward silence between them. "So," he said casually, "who else from your team is coming on this conference?" Olivia's smile was instant but brittle, a performance she hadn't fully rehearsed. "Oh, just a few colleagues. You wouldn't know them." "I might." Dan's tone was light, almost playful, but he could see the shadow flicker across her face. "After all, you've been with the company for years. I've heard plenty of names." She fumbled with the buckle on her bag, pretending to check for something she didn't need. "It's mostly junior staff. I doubt you'd care." Dan let it slide, watching her fingers tremble slightly. He'd always admired Olivia's polish. She could walk into any room and own it, all sleek confidence and sharp edges. But now, that veneer was cracking, like fine china after a hairline fracture, only one hard tap away from shattering. When the drink cart rolled by, Dan ordered another Prosecco and one for Olivia. "Let's toast," he said, to surprise it. She raised her cup, but her hand shook just enough for a few drops to spill onto her blouse. "Cheers," she whispered, her voice paper thin. By the time they landed, Olivia's composure was starting to splinter. She clutched her phone like a life raft, scrolling endlessly through screens without reading a word. Dan walked half a step behind her through the breezy open-air terminal, letting her stew in the silence. He didn't press her, didn't confront her. That would come later. At the perfect moment, in the perfect place. At baggage claim, Olivia darted toward the carousel, pretending not to notice Dan was right behind her. When her sleek silver suitcase tumbled down the belt, Dan reached for it first. "I'll grab it," he said, flashing her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," she mumbled. As they stepped into the bright tropical heat, Olivia's phone buzzed in her hand. Dan leaned slightly, just enough to glimpse the name on the screen before she turned it away. Eric. Of course. Dan took his time hailing a cab, even though Olivia kept looking around nervously, searching for someone, or making sure no one saw her arrive with her husband. The driver loaded their bags into the trunk and they slid into the back seat together. The intimacy felt hollow, like a couple posing for pictures long after love had left the frame. The resort was stunning, white stone, pathways winding between palm trees, crystal water shimmering beyond the infinity pool. Dan inhaled deeply, letting the salt air fill his lungs. Olivia, meanwhile, looked like a woman walking into her own execution. The front desk clerk greeted them warmly, handing over the key to the ocean view suite Dan had carefully booked. Olivia's knuckles turned white around her purse strap, but she forced a smile. "This is such a surprise," she said, her voice high and brittle. "Surprise is the word of the day," Dan agreed. They followed the bellhop to the suite. Olivia trailed slightly behind, every step slower than the last. Dan tipped the bellhop and stepped inside first, letting the weight of the moment settle over them both. The room was exactly as he remembered. Crisp white linens, floor-to-ceiling glass, the terrace opening to endless blue. Except now, it wasn't a honeymoon suite. It was a crime scene waiting to happen. Dan set Olivia's suitcase down, but instead of unpacking, he crossed to the minibar, popped a bottle of champagne, and filled a single flute. Olivia perched awkwardly on the edge of the bed, watching him. "No glass for me?" she asked, her smile stretched thin. "This one's special," Dan said. "It's for big decisions." She didn't ask what kind. Maybe she didn't want to know. Minutes later, they strolled toward the resort bar, Olivia slightly ahead, Dan content to follow. The air was thick with tension, like the hush before a storm. And then, as if scripted, Eric was there. Loud Hawaiian shirt, cocktail in hand, grin wide enough to swallow the sunset. "Hey, Liv!" Eric's voice carried over the crowd. He froze when he saw Dan beside her, confusion flickering across his tanned face. Dan raised his glass, two surprises. The bar glowed gold against the twilight sky, its bamboo counter polished smooth by decades of drunk confessions and vacation flings. Olivia's heels clicked unevenly as she led the way, her pace caught between flight and obligation. Dan followed, hands in his pockets, humming a soft tune. A habit she'd once found charming. Tonight it was the drumbeat of her impending doom. Eric was easy to spot. He had that effortless frat boy posture, arms sprawled across the bar, one flip-flop dangling off his foot, and a ridiculous neon cocktail in his hand. His shirt, a vulgar explosion of pineapples and flamingos, made Dan's teeth clench on instinct. It was almost offensive how predictable he was. The moment Eric saw Olivia, his grin spread wide, too wide. That kind of smile only belonged to two types of men, newly promoted sales reps and idiots who didn't realize they were about to become a punchline. "Liv!" Eric's voice cut through the soft murmur of other guests. He was already out of his seat, moving toward her with arms half raised for a hug. Then his gaze slid past her shoulder and locked onto Dan. The pause was exquisite. Dan watched the mental math play out across Eric's sunburnt face. "Husband. Here. Not supposed to be here." "Oh shit." Olivia, ever the quick thinker under pressure, plastered on her corporate smile, the same one she used to handle awkward holiday dinners with clients' wives. "Dan, this is Eric. He works with me." Dan stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Oh, we've already worked together, haven't we, Eric?" Eric shook his hand, a split second too late. His grip was damp, Weak, the handshake of a man whose confidence had been suddenly misplaced. Right, Dan, great to finally meet you. Dan gestured to the bartender. 3 drinks, on me. We've got so much to toast. Olivia tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Dan was already in the driver's seat, hands firm on the wheel. So, Eric, how long have you been working with Olivia? Eric's laugh was just a hair too loud. Couple years? Great team player, your wife? Team player, Dan echoed, savoring the phrase like fine wine. That's exactly what I'd call her. Olivia's nails tapped a staccato rhythm against her glass. Dan, let's not bore Eric with shop talk. It's vacation. Dan leaned against the bar, smiling in that slow, predatory way that made Olivia's stomach twist. Oh, I insist. I'm dying to hear about these conferences she's been so busy with. They must be exhausting. All that work after hours. Eric swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed like a drowning man. Well, networking, brainstorming, sometimes we just blow off steam. Blow off steam, Dan repeated. That's healthy. So healthy. Eric's eyes darted toward Olivia, silently begging her to intervene, but she was too busy draining her drink in frantic gulps. Dan clapped Eric on the shoulder harder than necessary. I almost didn't come. Figured Olivia deserved some solo time, but then I thought, why not see her world, meet her colleagues? So glad I did. The bartender delivered a round of champagne. Dan's choice, he raised his glass. To partnerships, professional and otherwise. The toast hung in the air like a storm cloud. Olivia's smile faltered, Eric's grin froze, and Dan savored every brittle second. They took their drinks to a table overlooking the ocean. The sun had fully set, leaving the sky indigo and the sea black as spilled ink. The flicker of tiki torches cast ghost shadows across their faces. So, Eric, Dan said, voice silk smooth. You married? Eric shook his head too quickly. Nope. Still playing the field. Smart, Dan said. Marriage is tricky. All that trust, all those secrets. Olivia coughed into her drink. Dan, seriously, enough. But Dan was just warming up. You know the funny thing about trust, Eric? It's like those sandcastles down there. He gestured toward the beach. Takes hours to build, seconds to wash away. Eric tried a weak chuckle. Right? Dan downed his champagne, eyes never leaving Eric's. Speaking of deep, Olivia always did love this resort. Said it was her happy place. Olivia's hand curled into a fist beneath the table. Dan, what? I'm celebrating your favorite spot. Dan leaned back, stretching his arms. After all, this suite we're staying in, it's special. Same one from our honeymoon. Remember, Liv? Eric went pale. Olivia went rigid. Dan signaled for another round. As the drinks kept coming, Dan shifted tactics from chilling implication to disarming charm. He asked Eric about his hobbies, his favorite places to travel, his most embarrassing drunk story. The three of them started to resemble friends, at least to anyone passing by. But beneath the surface, Olivia was unraveling, one tiny thread at a time. By the time Dan excused himself to use the restroom, Olivia leaned across the table, her whisper sharp as broken glass. What are you doing? Dan grinned. Getting to know your colleague, is that a problem? Her fingers dug into her napkin. You know exactly what you're doing. He leaned down, close enough to whisper in her ear, Oh, sweetheart, I haven't even started. Then he walked away, leaving her alone with Eric, 2 empty champagne flutes, and the unmistakable sense that this vacation was about to become a nightmare neither of them would forget. Dan took his time walking back from the bar, hands sliding into his pockets, fingers brushing over his phone. He wasn't checking messages, there was no need. Everything that mattered was already in motion. This wasn't improvisation, it was a script. And Dan knew every scene by heart. He let Olivia and Eric stew alone for a few minutes longer, giving them just enough space for panicked whispers and clumsy damage control. By the time he strolled back, their drinks were nearly drained, and Olivia's polished corporate mask had a hairline fracture running right through the middle. Should we call it a night? Olivia's voice was too bright, too eager to retreat. It's been such a long day. Dan smiled, all teeth. Great idea, let's head back to the suite. She froze. We don't have to. But we do, Dan, cut her off gently, placing a hand on her lower back in a gesture that, to anyone watching, looked perfectly husbandly. I've got a surprise waiting. Olivia's smile flickered. What kind of surprise? The kind you'll never forget, Dan said softly. The walk back was almost silent, except for the soft hum of the waves. Eric trailed behind, unsure if he was being invited or escorted to his own execution. Dan didn't clarify. Why spoil the fun? They reached the suite door and Dan unlocked it with an exaggerated flourish. After you, he said, stepping aside to let Olivia enter first. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the handle, but there was no way out now. The only thing worse than walking in would be refusing to. The room was immaculate. Housekeeping had reset it while they were at the bar. Fresh white sheets, a bottle of champagne chilling in a silver bucket. The terrace doors left open just enough for the sea breeze to curl inside. A picture-perfect paradise. Except for the suitcase. Dan's suitcase, wide open in the center of the bed. Inside it, neat rows of clothes. His, not hers. And beside them, a small stack of hotel key cards. Olivia's collection. She made a strangled sound in the back of her throat, halfway between a gasp and a sob. Dan. He stepped past her, picking up the top card and turning it over in his fingers. Azure Sands, January 14th. Do you remember that trip? You told me it was a leadership retreat. He flicked the card onto the bed like a playing card. You left this one behind. Under the dresser. Ugh. Eric cleared his throat. I should probably... Dan raised a hand without looking at him. Stay. You're part of the surprise. Olivia was already unraveling, hands clutching at the hem of her dress like a drowning woman grasping for a rope. Dan, I can explain. Oh, please do, Dan said, his voice soft and lethal, because I've been dying to know how 12 different rooms at 6 different resorts fit into your corporate development plan. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Dan gestured to the champagne. Drink? Neither of them moved. Dan shrugged, popped the bottle himself, and poured a single glass. The ritual, his ritual. Olivia knew exactly what it meant, and so did Dan. To freedom, he said, raising the glass in a lazy toast. Mine, not yours. The silence stretched, too thin to hold. Eric shifted uncomfortably, pulling at his ridiculous shirt, sweat blooming across his chest. Look, Dan. You, Dan turned to Eric, smile widening. You fascinate me. Eric blinked. Me? Yeah, you knew she was married. Knew who I was. And yet, here you are, sipping my champagne and screwing my wife in my favorite resorts. Dan's head tilted slightly, like a man studying a rare species. I don't even know if I should hate you or thank you. Thank me? Eric's voice cracked. Dan sipped his drink. Sure. If you hadn't been so colossally stupid, I might have stayed married another 10 years, playing the role of Olivia's convenient paycheck. He gestured to the room. This is a gift. Olivia took a step forward, her voice trembling. Dan, we can fix this. Dan burst out laughing, a sharp, bright sound that bounced off the glass walls. Fix it? Sweetheart, we passed fixable about 30,000 feet ago. Her face crumpled, mascara smudging beneath her eyes. I didn't mean to hurt you. Oh, spare me. Dan set down the glass, turning serious. You didn't think about me at all. That's the truth. You thought about the thrill, the secrecy, the champagne on arrival. But me? I was the afterthought. She collapsed onto the bed beside the suitcase, fingers brushing against the damning stack of keycards. So what now? Dan smiled again, slow and dangerous. Now? I leave. Eric's head snapped up. Wait, what? Dan grabbed his carry-on from the closet, already packed. The room's paid through the weekend. Enjoy it, both of you. Olivia stood, reaching for him. Dan, please. He stepped back. No, you had your fun. Now I'm having mine. Eric, bewildered, raised a hand like a kid in detention. So, we're good? Dan stared at him for a long moment. Eric, you have the emotional depth of a pothole. I don't care if we're good. You're her problem now. Dan strolled to the door, pausing for just a second. Oh, and Olivia? She looked up, eyes wide and wet. You get the bill. He stepped out, shutting the door with a soft click, leaving them alone, in paradise, with their wreckage. Dan didn't look back as he walked down the corridor. Behind that door was a marriage reduced to rubble, the final embers of a life he no longer wanted to salvage. Every step away from the suite felt lighter, like he was shedding a layer of skin that had grown too tight, too brittle. By the time he reached the elevator, his wedding ring was already in his pocket. The ride down was quiet, save for the faint hum of tropical music leaking from the lobby speakers. As the doors opened, Dan paused for a moment. His reflection stared back, slightly unshaven, linen shirt creased from the day, but the man looking out wasn't broken. He looked free. There was no tremor in his hand, no weight in his chest, just silence where the noise used to be. At the front desk, he slid the room key across the counter. "Checking out early," he said with a smile. "My wife will handle the rest." The clerk, oblivious to the hurricane that had passed through that suite, nodded politely. "Of course, sir. Will you need transportation?" Dan shook his head. "No need. I'll take my time." He stepped into the warm night air, the salty breeze tangling in his hair. For a moment he just stood there, breathing it in, the scent of salt, jasmine, and a freedom so sharp it almost hurt. Olivia was probably pacing the suite by now, alternating between tears and fury. Eric would be fumbling for words, trying to find the exit in a situation with no map. Dan had left them exactly where they deserved, together, in their mess. With his carry-on slung over his shoulder, Dan walked to the beachside path. The sand was cool under his feet, the moon painting silver ribbons across the waves. Couples strolled hand in hand, oblivious to the man walking alone with a half smile and a heart newly emptied. For the first time in years, Dan wasn't planning around anyone else. No dinners to coordinate, no anniversaries to remember, no pretending to care about Olivia's latest obsession with boutique wellness retreats. His calendar was blank, and for the first time, that emptiness felt like possibility, not loss. He found a bench overlooking the water and pulled out his phone. One tap opened his flight app. The reservation to Iceland stared back at him. A trip he'd dreamed of for years but always postponed because Olivia hated the cold. Not anymore. He booked the flight without hesitation, a one-way ticket leaving the following evening. No return date, no agenda, just a man, a suitcase, and a destination that had nothing to do with anyone else's dreams. It felt indulgent, almost rebellious, and Dan couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. As the confirmation email chimed, Dan reached into his bag. The last bottle of champagne he'd brought from home, his ritual, rested inside. He popped the cork right there on the beach, poured a generous splash into the plastic cup from his carry-on, and raised it to the sky. "To packing light," he said softly, and leaving the baggage behind. The champagne tasted brighter than usual, sharper, cleaner. Freedom always did. In the morning, Olivia would wake to an empty bed, a half-paid bill, and a future without Dan to anchor her. Eric would vanish, the thrill of stolen affection dissolving once the secrecy was gone. And Dan? He'd be 30,000 feet in the air, heading toward glaciers and hot springs, where nobody knew his name or his past. A seabird called overhead, cutting through the silence, and Dan laughed out loud, the first real laugh in months. This was closure, not with fireworks, but with the quiet weight of a door closing. And for the first time in a long time, Dan Carter wasn't a husband, or a betrayed man, or anyone's safety net. He was just himself, finally enough.